So the first time that we told you about this new book called Great Society: A New History by author Amity Shlaes, it wasn't available to purchase. It is now available to purchase. It came out November 26th. Everyone's doing their Christmas shopping. And so we wanted to have her back on to talk about this book. She's on the line right now. Amity, welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yes, I'm so glad that you could spend some time with us this morning. So we've talked about your other books. You're a New York Times best-selling author. You've written about The Forgotten Man. You've written about Calvin Coolidge. By the way, the Conduit founders have recently visited the Calvin Coolidge Center in Washington, D.C., and I guess it's the Coolidge House. And, Calvin Coolidge, his principles are like right down the line of what our principles are. And so your book about Calvin Coolidge is also an excellent read. So what can you tell us, Amity, about how this book so far is being received, your new book, Great Society?
The current book is called Great Society, and this morning the New York Times called it deeply flawed. So let's start with that.
Okay. The New York Times calls it deeply flawed. So what? That's got to be a good thing, actually. That probably means that it's completely 100% accurate.
Well, I'm friendly to the New York Times because they also excerpted the book. But that's an example. That is, they printed part of the book in their newspaper, and I'm very happy about that. And that part included, by the way, Wilbur Mills, at least in the first draft. So what it tells us is that the topic of the Great Society, this 1960s period when the government looked like it was supposed to do everything and that it would succeed, is controversial. And that is true. And what my book says is it was really nice for government to try to intervene, but most of what it did, threw a grenade or laid a time bomb for later. So the Great Society was not great. It was problematic, and therefore we shouldn't emulate it.
And so, and I know we've talked about before. Oftentimes, whatever the stated goal is, we were trying to tackle this problem, but you get negative results elsewhere, right? And so your book exposes that.
Well, that's right. I mean, Lyndon Johnson really wanted to do everything for poor people. He promised to cure poverty. He didn't say create a palliative. He said cure poverty. And we didn't cure poverty. In fact, poverty flattened out by our poverty data to about 1 in 10 families. And he thought he would end racial division by establishing what we know as affirmative action. Instead, that fostered racial division. It deepened the cracks between blacks and whites, which is sad. He thought that the federal government could make America better. Instead, he destroyed a good swath of old America, what you might call Tocqueville America, the America where communities took care of themselves. They didn't always do a perfect job, but often they did a better job than our history books allow. And imagine a great steamroller coming to your community, and we're kind of going to roll over, flatten what is in place in terms of local institutions or obviate them in order to introduce a federal office to save the people, which doesn't do that very well. So it was an important period, and we live. We think, Paul, that the New Deal of the 1930s shaped our modern life. That's not true to the extent that the Great Society of the 1960s shapes our modern life. Our spending on commitments we initiated in the Great Society is greater than our spending on commitments we initiated in the 1930s. I didn't know that, actually, but there's a chart in the back of the book that shows you when it happened, when those lines crisscrossed. So why, nowadays we talk about both parties. We talk about the importance of idealism and something different, and then here this book shows that idealism was painful. Even Medicare and Medicaid, which many people like, or extensions of Social Security, have comforted many of us in my generation. I'm turning 60, but we've left our children with a terrible debt because Medicare can't be paid for, and then after that, pretty soon Social Security goes into deficit, runs out of money as well, worse than deficit. So I was curious to find, Paul, the many parallels between the ambition and idealism of the early 60s and the ambition and idealism of our current period.
I'm very, very interested to hear about the fact that the new programs steamrolled the local ones. That to me is fascinating because it almost produces a current mentality where I've often speculated, has that made us less charitable than we used to be? Because a lot of times people are like, well, I pay taxes for that. Or it's kind of like the Ebenezer Scrooge line when he's asked for more money. Don't my taxes go to, the workhouses and things like that? And so I wonder if that's also not a consequence from the Great Society.
Well, I would say there were times, usually when you cut taxes, I mean, in history, I used to work at the Wall Street Journal, and we write these editorials about how charitable giving did fine when taxes are reduced overall. In fact, it sometimes does better because people have more money and they begin to assume more responsibility for their community. When people are fleeced, they're not in a giving mood. I already gave at the office to the federal government through my withholding. So that's enough now. The 2017 Act reduced as far as I understand it, and I'm going off the topic of my book, but reduced the number of taxpayers who might claim a deduction for charitable giving, and even perhaps reduced the tax savings in some cases. So, we have some evidence now that charitable contributions took a hit in 2018. Charity is the first impulse. It's the best impulse. It's not just because, private giving is holy. It's because we tend to give charity at home. And when you give at home, you know what you're giving to. And therefore, you make more rational decisions. You look at two hospitals or two churches and you say, which serves the people better? Well, in my opinion, the one on this street does, and the one on that street, I have my doubts, so I'm going to go to Street A and give to that institution. That discretion, that judgment of the people is gone in a federal program written by people in Washington who happen to know, by the way, neither institution, neither church, neither hospital. To them, churches in the town are all far away, and it depends how they fill out an application for a grant or support. Or it depends whether the federal government is introducing a new institution to obviate both those old, respected institutions. There's one example in my book I want to talk about. It's in St. Louis. In St. Louis, there was a very healthy community chest and charitable community. St. Louis is a German-American community, and you could feel it. You could feel the old kind of German way of taking care of one's own. And when the urban renewal came, which was even before the Great Society, urban renewal steamrollered the downtown, including, by the way, a lot of institutions, and built giant high-rise project homes for poor people. So they lost their tenement, which might not have a good bathroom, but which was where they had chosen to live, and were moved almost without, much say for themselves. Here's into these tall buildings, which are called Pruitt-Igoe. And the federal government helped to pay for that, and the city fathers of St. Louis went along because, hey, the federal government was helping to pay, and therefore they would not have to raise taxes. Lawmakers at home don't always like to do that. And this tall set of buildings, Pruitt-Igoe, were a disaster because they didn't suit families. They had weird setups. For example, the elevator didn't stop on every floor, so you had to go up and down stairs, and that's where the gangs beat you up. There wasn't much commerce, which has a civilizing effect. There was no little store on the basement level. There was not even a really good playground. There was just kind of a vast, isolating park. and it became a nest for crime, Pruitt-Igoe. And eventually, at the end of the book, so I tell the story all the way through, two things happened. One was a local church decided, Father Shockley was his name, one of the churches that happened to remain standing after the bulldozers began to move people out, Father Shockley, into homes of their own. That is, help them buy a home. Some federal money came for that, but it was mostly a local effort. Local banks, local companies started to move people into homes of their own, that they got ownership, and the people were very happy. What happened then? They had to blow up Pruitt-Igoe, all of it, because it was such a tragedy, a danger, and an embarrassment. So that one housing project, and I'm sure you have some in your area too, is the emblem of what happens when a government comes and tells everyone it's doing good, particularly a faraway government. The architect, his name was Yamasaki, was a nice man, but he had to deal with all the rules the federal government gave him about the housing, including density rules, including where the elevators go, as I mentioned, including. And later, he made a remarkably frank confession. Makes you like him. He said, "I wish I had never built it. I had never built this Pruitt-Igoe complex," which was the largest public housing in America. I should mention that.
Wow.
So we wish we had never done it. That is what you hear over and over again about the projects of the 1960s. And we're not even talking here about welfare and families and various projects specific to your region.
We're talking with Amity Shlaes, author of the new book, A Great Society, A New History. Alan Greenspan says, Great Society is accurate history that reads like a novel covering the high hopes and catastrophic missteps of our well-meaning leaders. Amity, you mentioned that the New York Times today said that it was flawed. What specifically are they referring to?
Well, they say America should probably be spending more than we spent in the 1960s.
Okay.
More, and well, I didn't quite get all the logic, but the author, Benjamin Applebaum, was critical basically because, gosh, I don't want to misrepresent him, but because he thought that I didn't offer the generous possibility. What I say in the book is, how would America have looked if we'd left businesses more free to grow and community institutions more free to grow rather than telling them how it's all supposed to go? It might have been better. That's what I write. He says, well, she doesn't ask, Amity doesn't ask, how would it have been if we had spent more? Well, if we had spent more, our economy wouldn't have grown. I think the real answer is we'd have fewer jobs now.
Yeah.
The Europe story is the story of how it would be if you spend more. And Europe had to draw back from its big social democratic spending. Europe unemployment is higher than our unemployment historically. And you see that, as the European social democracy grew and they continued the experiment that we didn't, their structural unemployment rose above ours. And that was a shock because for a long time it was lower because they were scrappy countries trying to recover from World War II and everybody worked.
You mentioned the family earlier. So what effect did the Great Society have on the family? Versus then versus now?
What we're talking about is when the federal government or government policy affects the family. And it actually commenced this effect of the federal government, the negative effect, with welfare, which was originally a great New Deal program, right? So in the 30s, what welfare money went to the states and went to the individuals, and the states had a lot of say in what happened to welfare money, and they tended to want to give it to only single moms. If a dad is there, well, if you have a dad there, you don't deserve welfare money. So what welfare money did, and public housing made it worse, was encourage the moms who were poor to live alone in the public housing so they could get the welfare and maybe the housing benefit as well. So it created a huge marginal cost, to put it in economic terms, a huge marginal cost to staying together as a family, which is perverse. And there's also a film about Pruitt-Igoe, which I recommend, where the people who lived there, who were children at the time, remember how they had to lie and pretend they had no dad, or the dads might even hide in the closet. And the children wonder, why is my mother lying? When you see your parent lie, time stops, and you say, why is this person who's so important to me, who I admire so much, lying? What fear would force a parent to lie? Because children know about parents' fear. And the answer was the mother needed the money. So this was continued, though they recognized the trouble, and their episodic mentions, intermittent mentions by Kennedy, Johnson administration, and so on. They knew that they didn't want to hurt the family, but they effectively did. And of course, this idea of illegitimate birth was part of that, and illegitimate birth only strengthened, both, by the way, at first among blacks, but also among whites. And we created the perpetual matriarchy, the perpetual dad-free family, and perpetual trouble with young men.
Gosh.
But I think our listeners know that already.
Yeah. Well, they
and I don't mean to offend anyone personally, but we perpetuated it through the great. When a problem had already been there, we perpetuated and strengthened and institutionalized and codified.
Yeah, and to me, I think the Great Society, from my point of view, is really just a lot of socialistic tendencies. So, but now we have your book, your great book, and I think it, to me, is representing evidence that socialism doesn't work. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes. The first sentence of the book is, why not socialism? Because that's part of the idealism, right? If you're a young person, you want to be logical, you want to go all the way. Why not socialism, Dad? Why not socialism, Mom? It sounds nice. I can't remember it doing anything bad. And this, in the book, it's a character who went to the federal government hoping to see the president, and getting in to talk to a rather high White House official, that was Sergeant Shriver, the poverty czar, with the idea, why not socialism? Sort of like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez today. It sounds nice. What's wrong with you government people? You're so corrupted and so compromising. How about a pure ideal? And what I show in the book is we didn't get communist socialism. These young socialists were, by and large, not traitors. They didn't report to Moscow. They were just wrong. And what we got was halfway socialism, sometimes known as social democracy, through the expansion of the federal government in the Great Society, and Nixon's in this too, by the way. And even halfway socialism, the evidence suggests, is too far. It's sort of like the discussion today. You say, well, I'm not wild about Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren because they like socialist ideas, and I don't, and I don't think they're good for my community. But heck, they might only get halfway. They might be, like that. And the truth is, halfway is indeed too far. So the halfway results of half socialism of the '60s give us some warnings. One example is guaranteed income. This is a very popular idea because giving people money sounds better than separating their families with perverse welfare rules. But giving people money, and the leader in that was Daniel Patrick Moynihan. You've heard that name before. He was not yet a senator, but he was a White House advisor to Richard Nixon. He said, let's give people money. Milton Friedman said that. What can be wrong with that? Well, what happens, he discovered when he tried to write the law, is at what point you stop giving the people money. Again, their marginal taxes go way up. They stop receiving. They start paying. It's the same problem as the earned income credit, and I know many of your listeners are familiar with that. So they're deterred from working more at, say, $30,000 a year or $20,000 a year, or in Moynihan's time, $10,000 a year, because they have to take a huge hit, and they lose their special housing or they lose their Medicaid, and therefore even paying people money, guaranteed income, has a perverse outcome.
Yeah, there's
just at a later point in the income scale.
Wow. The book, ladies
setting
and gentlemen.
Aside what,
go ahead.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
To rant a lot, but setting aside what it does to you morally, which is the more important question. What does it do to an 18-year-old to tell him he's entitled to money? What does that do to his own drive, his own conception of the world? And I want to add, that is more important, because what 18-year-olds need, or 16-year-olds, or 20-year-olds, is a sense that they're on their own. That helps them to try. One of the fascinating people I've met in my life is Harold Hamm, the energy king of Oklahoma. Mr. Ham had to do everything for himself. He got married very young. He had trouble finishing high school, and went to college, but he barely had time because he had to earn money because he was married and his family didn't have a lot of money. He came from a poor family. And that energized him, and he became Harold Ham. Continental Resources, right? A great big energy company, led the way in the energy revolution. I wonder what it would have been like if you had said to Harold, who's a smart man, here's $1,000 a month for you, and we'll pay for the college all the way, and we'll pay for the health care. Would he have had the energy to do something new? The same reason young men and women bust out, join the Army and Navy, even though their mother is quite concerned, is that need to show the world that one can support oneself, and that need is precious. So what do we do when we start these handout businesses? We undermine that need. We infantilize our children. We cause them to live in hotel parents the rest of their lives.
Wow.
We impair them. Sorry to be so bossy.
No, Amity, it's been a great time talking with you. Your book, again, Great Society, A New History. Amity Shlaes, everybody. Amity, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning.
Oh, thank you.